So, art as a coping mechanism. We've seen it time and time again, from 8.5 to All That Jazz, even Fitzcarraldo. Stories about artists who turn creation into survival tool, a way to process grief, guilt, and the quiet terror of being alive. Dramatic, I know. With his latest movie, Danish-Norwegian filmmaker Joachim had his work cut out for him. I mean, how do you revisit the familiar territory of damaged families, melancholic artists, Oslo as a memoryscape, and a Reinsve character caught between self-invention and inherited pain without it feeling played out? Well, somehow the director pulls it off, and in this episode, you're going to find out how. I'm Pedro from Vinyl N Celluloid, and this is my review of Sentimental Value. Now, for as long as Scandinavian cinema has been discussed internationally, it has existed in conversation with one towering figure, Ingmar Bergman. Whether they like it or not, filmmakers working in this space are often measured by how they respond to his legacy. Some push against it, some exaggerate it, and even others try to bury it entirely. And we've seen different ways of doing that over the years. Lars von Trier externalized Bergman's interior anguish into provocation and cruelty. Nicholas Winding Refn abandoned psychological intimacy altogether in favor of iconography, violence, and surface. Ruben Östlund turned inward conflict outward, transforming private anxiety into public humiliation and social satire. Each of them found a way to step out from under that shadow by reacting loudly. What makes Joachim Trier different is that he doesn't seem interested in reacting at all. The director has always carried some unmistakably Bergman-esque traits. Families as emotional battlegrounds, confined spaces heavy with unspoken history, conversations that circle wounds rather than heal them. Art used not as redemption, but as confession. Yet Sentimental Value doesn't read as an homage, nor as an attempt to escape influence. Rather, it reads as inheritance. Where Bergman often arrives at rupture, Trier arrives at coexistence. Whereas the Swedish filmmaker exposed a wound, the Norwegian counterpart asks what it means to live with it. There's no allegorical exorcism here, no grand reckoning, just a slow, awkward work of acknowledging damage and choosing to remain present anyway. That's why this 2025 title feels less like a work wrestling with legacy and more like one quietly at peace with it. Trier isn't trying to outgrow Bergman, reject him, or modernize him. He's translating that emotional language into something recognizably contemporary, softer around the edges, but no less precise. And in doing so, he confirms something important. This is not a filmmaker still finding his voice. This is a movie director who knows exactly where he comes from and no longer feels the need to prove it. But before breaking down why everything works so well in this title, let's quickly go through the plot section. Sentimental Value follows Gustav Borg, played by Stellan Skarsgård, an aging, once celebrated film director who returns to his family's old house after a loss and decides to mount a deeply personal comeback project drawn from his own past. He tries to involve his estranged daughters, Nora, played by Renate Reinsve, a talented but emotionally fragile stage and television actress, and Agnes, played by Inga, Ibsdotter, Lilleaas, a historian who has built a more stable life away from the industry. When his daughter Nora refuses to act in his new project, Gustav casts rising American star Rachel Kemp, played by Elle Fanning instead, pulling this outsider into the family home and blurring the line between biography and fiction as production begins and old wounds resurface. Now, to understand how all of this plays out in practice, it's worth grounding ourselves in the story Trier builds. What Sentimental Value does better than most contemporary dramas is refuse release. From the opening scenes onward, the story operates under a constant, low-level emotional pressure. Not spikes, not crescendos, just a steady strain that never lets up. Pain doesn't arrive in explosions or confrontations designed to clear the air. It accumulates quietly through pauses, glances, and moments that remain unresolved by design. You're not being pushed towards catharsis. You're being held inside discomfort. That distinction matters. You see, so many dramas about family fallout rely on escalation. Arguments build, secrets surface. Someone finally says the thing that's been buried, and the emotional system resets. Trier rejects that rhythm entirely. Scenes don't conclude because they've delivered payoff. They end when there's simply nothing left to say, or when saying more would only deepen the impasse. The result is a piece that registers as uncomfortably exact. Every beat is calibrated, every exchange feels measured rather than improvised, but never mechanical. You feel the strain not because you're being manipulated, but because the work refuses to let you off the hook. There is no emotional punctuation, no moment where pressure is discharged so the viewer can relax before the next movement. What's especially striking is how often the narrative approaches moments that could function as relief and then deliberately sidesteps them. A reconciliation that almost happens, a gesture that feels like it might soften the harm, a conversation that seems to be moving toward clarity. Each time, Trier pulls back just enough to preserve the unease, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. This precision creates a very specific viewing experience. You're constantly alert, reading between the lines, aware of what the story refuses to tell you. The experience doesn't overwhelm you. It tightens its grip gradually. And by refusing to spike emotion artificially, it achieves something far more difficult: emotional continuity. That continuity mirrors the reality being depicted. Unresolved family fallout doesn't erupt once and disappear. It hums in the background. It shapes behavior. It influences tone, posture, and silence. Trier builds pressure the same way trauma actually works: quiet, persistently, without spectacle. That's why the control here never feels cold. This isn't discipline for its own sake. It's discipline in service of truth. That sustained pressure isn't accidental. It's built, line by line, moment by moment, into the way people speak and don't speak to one another. And a huge part of this pressure comes from the writing. Dialogue in Sentimental Value is deliberately incomplete. Conversations falter, loop back on themselves, or stop just short of articulation. What carries the most weight is often what fails to surface, and Trier treats silence not as an empty space, but as narrative information. The characters aren't unusually lucid. They understand each other more than they're willing to admit. They recognize where it hurts. They can name the fracture intellectually. What they can't do is move past it. That shared recognition becomes its own burden, and it's precisely where language begins to break down. Instead of pushing characters towards clarity through speech, Trier allows dialogue to collapse under the weight of what it's trying to carry. Talk about the problem, they change subjects, they retreat into politeness or professional language, and when words fail, hesitation takes over. These pauses aren't passive, they're active choices. Silence becomes confrontational. Delay becomes refusal. A character choosing not to finish a sentence can carry as much meaning as a confession would in a more conventional script. The work trusts the viewer completely in this regard. There is no underlining, no musical cue telling you how to feel, no explanatory dialogue inserted to guarantee comprehension. You're asked to listen closely, to notice when someone avoids eye contact, to register when a response arrives half a beat too late. That trust extends to the overall structure. Scenes don't exist to deliver information efficiently. They exist to allow emotional states to coexist without resolution. Conversations rarely conclude with understanding. More often than not, they end with the shared recognition of distance. This approach aligns perfectly with the emotional logic at play. These are people who have already done the self-analysis. Self-knowledge hasn't cured anything. So the language reflects that impasse. The story isn't about discovering the truth, it's about living with it. By building the narrative around hesitation and omission, Trier creates something intimate without being invasive. You're close enough to read every tremor in a face, but never pushed into artificial disclosure. The absence of sound becomes the space where meaning accumulates, and the lack of presence of explanation becomes the point. Of course, that kind of writing only works if the performances are capable of carrying what's left unsaid. And in Sentimental Value, this is one of those rare cases where the ensemble doesn't decorate the story. It is the story. The emotional logic here lives or dies in how these performances interlock. Stellan Skarsgård's Gustav is played as a man whose ego is both massive and wounded. Confident in his artistic identity, yet deeply uncertain about his legitimacy as a father. There's guilt, but no self-pity. He understands his failures intellectually whilst remaining emotionally defensive. Crucially, Skarsgård never plays him as a villain. The harm he's caused isn't rooted in cruelty, but in avoidance and emotional miscalculation. Renate Reinsve, meanwhile, delivers a performance defined by interiority. Her character seems almost allergic to emotional display. Pain is managed, redirected, held at arm's length. You see it in posture, in delayed responses, in the way she occupies space, and most especially in that opening scene when she's about to perform in a play. What's remarkable is how little she offers the audience directly and how much that withholding communicates. Elle enters as a destabilizing presence, not a foil, not a romanticized outsider, and not even as a narrative vehicle, but as a catalyst. Through confused glances and hesitant questions, she reflects the abnormality of the emotional environment she stepped into. She doesn't resolve anything. She simply makes the dynamic visible by reacting to them honestly. In that sense, her performance functions structurally rather than narratively. Inga Ibsdotter Lilleaas completes the picture by embodying quiet inheritance. She watches, she absorbs, she carries the emotional residue of decisions made long before her involvement. Her performance never demands attention, yet deepens the entire field simply by being there. What's striking is that none of these performances seek dominance. There is no show stealing, no theatrical grandstanding. Each actor modulates their presence in relation to others. The ensemble functions like an emotional structure. Remove one element, and the balance collapses. That collective control reinforces everything the work is doing formally. These performances don't release pressure, they hold it. They don't clarify relationships, they complicate them. Acting here isn't expressive in a conventional sense, it's positional. Each character reveals themselves by where they stand emotionally, not by what they announce. All of that restraint ultimately feeds into what the story is really circling, what art can and cannot do for people who are already hurt. And at the center of Sentimental Value sits this deeply uncomfortable idea that art is not healing, it's communicative. For Gustav, filmmaking becomes a flawed love language, a way of reaching his daughters without ever fully apologizing. Creation functions as a coping mechanism rather than a cure. By inviting them into this process, he attempts to engineer forgiveness through collaboration instead of confession. The story never pretends this is enough. Art here does not redeem the past. It doesn't absolve anyone. It doesn't neatly transform pain into meaning. At best, it creates a space where damage can be acknowledged without being resolved. That distinction is crucial. This is where the father-daughter's dynamic gains its maturity. Everyone involved understands the problem, but no one is capable of fixing it. There's no villain, no victim, just people shaped by absence trying to coexist with it. The work refuses moral sorting. It doesn't reward lucidity with forgiveness. It doesn't punish failure with condemnation. It simply observes what happens when expression outpaces emotional repair. That refusal separates this piece from more romanticized depictions of creative families. It recognizes that expression does not guarantee connection, and that recognition does not equal absolution. Art can open a conversation. It cannot complete it. And yet, this isn't a cynical gesture. There is tenderness here. There is effort. What's rejected is the idea that effort alone is transformative. Because sometimes all art can do is hold space for damage without making it worse. That's where the story ultimately arrives. Not at healing, not at closure, but at coexistence. Because sometimes the most honest gesture isn't repair at all. It's simply staying present. Taken as a whole, Sentimental Value is a film that earns its impact through accumulation rather than assertion. Nothing here is rushed. Nothing is overstated. The effect comes from how patiently it allows emotional weight to settle, how carefully it trusts the audience to stay with discomfort instead of solving it on cue. What makes the experience so powerful is that it never confuses honesty with spectacle. The story doesn't strain for catharsis. The performances don't plead for sympathy. And the writing never over-explains what's already evident. Everything operates in alignment, creating a work that feels quietly rigorous, emotionally precise, and unusually confident in its restraint. By the time the credits roll, there's no sense of having been led to a conclusion. Instead, you're left with a feeling that lingers. A recognition, rather than a lesson. The kind of after effect that doesn't demand immediate analysis, but stays with you resurfacing in unexpected moments. That, for me at least, is the mark of something special. Sentimental Value isn't just one of Joachim Trier's most mature works to date. It's also one of the most accomplished films of the year, a drama that respects its characters, its audience, and its own emotional intelligence. It never aims to impress loudly. It simply holds its ground. And if this confirms anything, is that Trier is no longer working towards something. He's already there, which makes what comes next not just interesting, but genuinely exciting.